but you wanna be something. Yeah, well, all you really need is hope. And when you feel like you're nothing, but you wanna be something. Yeah, well, all you really need is hope. I just want you to trust me if you wanna be something.
Yeah, that's right. Let's go. Yeah, when you're feeling down and you're out, like you got nothing but doubt, you're alone in the crowd, just trying to figure it out. All of this cloud and this money got you feeling left out. Listen up to me now, every word that's out of my mouth. Wake up, it's me. You're gonna follow your dreams, or are you just gonna be another cog in the scene? You feel the hope in this beat, yeah, the hope that you need to proceed and be exactly what you want it to be. I feel right and I'm proud, hype and I'm loud. I'ma shout all about how I feel in the now. Ain't nobody ever gonna try to change me till I'm dead, pushing up daisies. I'm alone in the crowd, I won't feel down. I got hope right now, and I know I'll be found. I don't really care just what all other haters gotta say. I know everything I do is gonna make them fade away. Yeah.
And when you feel like you're nothing, but you wanna be something. Yeah, well, all you really need is hope. I just want you to trust me if you wanna be something. Yeah, then all you really need is hope.
Take a look in the mirror, are you seeing some fear? You hear the voice in your ear, can you start to see clear? Are the bad thoughts near? Or can you be where your feet are, yeah, when you stand right here and say no? I'm never gonna give up, I'm never gonna slow. The one that doesn't give up, never loses to a foe. The one that could show to myself I could go all the way to the top, can't stop me. I'm a soldier, always closer till it's over. Older, but I'm bolder, moving forward, motor, never slower. Good to know ya, don't go make me drop my shoulder. You need to believe you can achieve everything that you dream. Everything that you need. It's in the mind that you feed. It's in the time that you bleed. Every second of life is another blessing to me.
Yeah. And when you feel like you're nothing, but you wanna be something. Yeah, well, all you really need is hope. I just want you to trust me if you wanna be something.
Yeah. Let's go. Yeah, it's what you need when you're down, need when you're out. It's what you need when you're sad and when you feel left out.
How's everyone doing? I have had a rough week personally. Professionally, I've had a great week. So, there's always the good news. But I'm not going to get into it. I'm going to keep everything private for now. But, and on a theme, and I lucked out because Jimmy Aiken and Trent Horn just released a video right now on the theme that we've been talking about this week and last week, and the theme that I wanted to hit on tonight, which is, what do you do when the experts are just basing all of their opinions on assumptions? We trust apologists, and I would like to drill down harder on the dangers of apologetics and the dangers of groupthink and the dangers of appealing to the consensus alone, because the consensus changes, and those who are in the majority consensus now would have once been in the minority, and it will change again. So what happens? So what happens once that change happens? How do you know what's the right opinion, what's the wrong opinion when you're in the middle of flux, right? So we're going to cover, I don't know why, I don't know how, but Trent Horn and Jimmy Aiken are covering the same thing that I've been covering. So we're going to go into that one right now. Oh, hit the wrong one. No, I did. Okay, let's make this work. There we go. Got it. All right, so let's do this. Let me see what time this actually released. 13 hours ago, so this is fresh. I have not watched it. This is a live react. Let's fast forward it. You want to watch the video at regular speed and have it make more sense, go and watch it yourselves. Trent Horn obviously makes great content. All right, let's keep going.
They say the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he doesn't exist. But among some Christians, he's accomplished another great trick. He's convinced them that he and his demonic minions are around every corner. Now, scripture speaks of your adversary, the devil, who prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. So it's foolish to act like the devil doesn't exist. However, Christians can develop unhealthy behaviors and even put themselves in spiritual danger if they start to obsess over the demonic and see it in things where it's not present. So in today's episode, I have a simple point I want to get across alongside my friend and colleague, Jimmy Akin. It's not always demons.
Correct.
What prompted this episode was a friend of mine who sent me images of a handbook from a deliverance ministry that contained a long list of activities associated with the demonic. Now, some of the items on the list definitely put you in danger of demons, like devil worship. Others, like abortion, could have a connection to the demonic, but even if they didn't in a particular case, these are still bad things. But some of these activities were neither demonic nor bad. They included things like deja vu. Have we covered this topic before? Or martial arts like karate, judo, and jujitsu. Now, there may be a few gyms that promote Eastern ancestor worship, but there's nothing demonic about learning martial arts in general. I even have a t-shirt with Jesus putting the devil in a chokehold that says, Jesus always has your back. My colleague Jimmy Akin co-hosts a popular podcast called Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. I've had him on the show before to discuss all kinds of weird stuff, because these oddities also fascinate me. So I thought it'd be helpful to interview him in this episode to flesh out our message that it's not always demons. Jimmy, what are your general thoughts on over-attributing things we observe to demonic forces?
Howdy, Trent. Very happy to be with you today.
This is all very good points, very strong points, points that I make on this channel. I like to see my favorite apologists not being apologists and being human beings for a second. So this is good. This is good stuff. Don't, shit on them just because they're professional apologists. Not everything a professional apologist says is bad. They haven't said anything bad yet, so let's see.
The basic answer is that we need to find balance on the question of demons, just like we need to find balance on every other question. Demons are real, and we don't want to minimize, their activity in the world, but we also don't want to maximize it. We don't want to attribute more to them than they actually can claim credit for. In fact, historically, in Christian theology, the devil is just one of the three sources of sin. The classical sources of sin are reckoned as the world, meaning the bad example other people set, the flesh, meaning our own interior disordered desires, and then the devil. And so if you attributed every single sin that everybody commits directly to the devil, you're really giving him too much credit. And the same thing is true about other phenomena. In episode 188 of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, I took a look at the question of whether it's always demons, and I concluded that we should not leap to the demon hypothesis to explain something without evidence. Now, if
Good. All good. All good.
you got evidence for a demon being involved, then you need to pay attention to that evidence. But you can't just rationally leap to this hypothesis as an explanation unless you really do have evidence of a demon. And to make the point of how serious this is, I actually started the episode with like 6 or 7 instances where people, and mostly small children, were killed during at-home exorcisms. Now, these were not professionally done exorcisms, but there are people out there who are so...
And this is the problem with witch hunts, and I don't just mean in the Protestant Puritan sense or in the Catholic Inquisition sense. In general, this is the problem with witch hunts, because you can find evidence of anything. You look hard enough, you can find evidence for anything. That evidence isn't always conclusive, and that evidence isn't always correct. So, when I was obsessed with ghosts and demons, I spent a lot of time trying to find, proof of ghosts and demons. And I read a lot of books, a lot of nonfiction books about ghosts and demons. And all these were nonfiction books. And all of them took it very seriously and thought it was very real. After reading enough of them and looking at enough comparisons and enough facts, you realize that it's all bullshit, that it's all fake, that none of these books have actual information in them. But they, the writers, believe it. And the audience for these writers believe it. So it's not as simple as just, oh, I'm going to use these facts, because they're using facts too. They're just coming to a false conclusion. And it's not just about what's most likely, like Dan or Bart likes to say, because real life isn't about what's always likely. A lot of times, to put it bluntly, it's possible for a lot of improbable things to happen.
So afraid of demons that, if their 2-year-old is acting up, as 2-year-olds are wont to do, they will say, oh, my 2-year-old must have a demon, and what we need to do is hold my child under hot water, until the demon leaves. And that's resulted in a bunch of deaths. In fact, all of the deaths that I cited in this episode had been just within a 2-year period. So this is something that is a real danger that to human life, the people falsely thinking that demons are involved and trying to take steps to deal with it. Also, as I point out in the episode, if you attributed everything you don't understand to demons, that would have blocked the development of science, because what science does, including medicine, because what science does is it looks at unknown phenomena and it tries to find explanations for them. And if you just attribute everything you don't know to a demon and say, oh, well, we can't have anything to do with this, then you're not going to be doing science. You're not going to be doing medicine. And that's going to have a direct cost in human lives too, because as medicine has developed and science has developed, we've been able to help people survive in a way that we weren't able to before. I'd much rather have modern medicine than, say, the medicine that they had 2,000 years ago. So we really need to be careful before we just say something's a demon. It's reckless, and frankly, it makes Christians look paranoid when people propose
And makes them
demons
look
as an
silly.
explanation for something
Yeah, it does.
without having actual evidence. Now, like I said, if you've got real evidence that a demon is involved, by all means, you need to pay attention to it. But we need to be balanced on this question and not just reflexively leap to the demon hypothesis just because something is unknown or scary.
Let me go through.
So we're going to skip the aliens. We're going to skip well, maybe we'll do a little bit of Ghosts, but I really want to do the Dungeons and Dragons. So we're going to maybe play the intro to Ghosts and the outro to Ghosts, not much of it, and then we'll go straight into the Dungeons and Dragons and literature stuff.
People also sometimes claim to have seen ghosts and spirits. Is it possible to encounter the ghost of a deceased human being? Or are the sightings that we can't explain, are these just the work of demons?
So once again, demons are a possibility in various apparitions, as these are known. We often associate the term apparition in the Catholic community with apparitions of saints, but it also applies to any kind of appearance. That's what an apparition means, an appearance of a spirit. It could be a human spirit, it could be an angelic spirit, it could be a demonic spirit. And as we're told in Scripture, the devil does impersonate an angel of light. So it's possible you could have an apparition of the devil or, one of his minions. But you need evidence to propose that. What we read in Scripture is not that we are to assume that any apparition of a spirit is a demon. We're told instead to test the spirits. This is, 1 John 4. We're supposed to test them and find out whether they're being truthful or not. So we're not supposed to run away from spirits. We're not supposed to refuse to talk to them. We're supposed to test them. And if you get evidence that you're talking to a demon, well, then you want to sever contact. But it may not be a demon. It may be a genuine good angel. It might be a saint, or in the classic, traditional Catholic understanding, it might be a ghost. It might be the soul of a human being who is...
And let's not forget, it also might just be insanity or delusion. Let's not forget the secular answers as well.
In purgatory, very frequently, you'll hear about apparitions who will ask for forgiveness for things they did during life, or they'll ask for prayers, or they'll be trying to close up, tie up some loose ends from their life that they had. And there's nothing inconsistent with the Christian faith. Genuinely dealing with a spirit here. And the next question is, what kind of spirit is it? And you got to test it to find out the answer to that. You don't run away from it. You don't refuse to talk to it. You do the testing that Scripture says we need to do. If you'd like an example of a really interesting historical ghost encounter that happened in a Catholic context, I'd refer you to the Wizard Clip, which was an early, Revolutionary War era period apparition here in the United States of an apparent...
Well, skeptics out there, debunk it. All right, let's go. Let's go ahead into the Harry Potter stuff and to the Dungeons and Dragons stuff, the Satanic Panic.
On the list I showed you all earlier, there were some items that some of my listeners may associate with the demonic. These include role-playing games like Dungeons and Dragons, or fantasy novels like Harry Potter, and even heavy metal music. In a previous audio episode of my podcast, which I'll link to below, I show that many of these claims are unfounded. For example, some people claim Harry Potter is demonic because it contains real spells and names of demons. But the names in the book are just riffs on mythology or common English names. The claim that the spells in Harry Potter are real come from a news article claiming that a woman in Spain tried to cast one of the spells in Harry Potter and burned her house down. But she didn't magically burn down her house. She tried to boil a concoction on her stove and it caught fire. And when it comes to heavy metal music, some of it may be bad or even demonic. But just as the existence of demonic music doesn't mean all music is bad, the existence of demonic heavy metal music doesn't make all heavy metal music bad. In fact, there's a very popular Christian heavy metal band called Stryper who had an album called To Hell with the Devil. And when it comes to Dungeons and Dragons, this is just a fantasy game. Any game can become dangerous if you add dangerous elements to it, but this particular game doesn't have those elements as a part of it. I worry that if Catholics see the demonic in everything, then they're going to turn into a caricature that was previously reserved for Protestant fundamentalists like Jack Chick,
There you go.
whose comic on Dungeons and Dragons describes the game this way.
I mean, I couldn't say any of this part better myself.
Debbie thought playing Dungeons and Dragons was fun, until it destroyed her friend. Jimmy, how should Christians draw the line between fantasy play and literature and activities that are demonic?
So I got a funny story about Harry Potter. Because I'm an apologist, I needed to read the first Harry Potter book because there are all these claims about, oh, this is demonic and it's got real demonic spells in it and real names of demons. And so I read the first book, and frankly, I wasn't impressed. I don't think it's well written, but it did not have real demonic spells in it or real
Who knew? He's not a turf.
names of demons or anything like that. That's just not true. At the time, I was substituting as a Latin tutor for some homeschool students, and I went to class one night and I took a spell from Harry Potter. It was an eyeglass repair spell that one of the characters uses, and it was basically Oculus Reparito, and that was supposed to repair your eyeglasses. And so I assigned the students, parse this for me. Tell me what Latin words are in use here and what forms they're taking and so forth. And they started thinking about it because Oculus Reparito sounds Latin, and they started working on it, and they realized they couldn't parse it. And I said, that's right. You can't parse this. This is not only not a real spell, it's not even real Latin. So J.K. Rowling did not use real spells or even real Latin. She just made stuff up. It sounded kind of Latin-y, but it wasn't. Now, in terms of figuring out where the line is in fantasy play and fantasy literature versus the demonic,
Interesting. I like where this is going.
I would say that the basic criterion is, well, are you invoking demons or not? Are you calling on spirits, especially demonic spirits? If you're not invoking demons, then you're not invoking demons. And so you don't got to be paranoid about, what's going to happen with demons if I read this book, or what's going to happen with demons if I play this game. Is there a hypothetical possibility that a demon might, randomly encounter you and do something? Well, sure, but that's something that's part of all life. You could be going to the supermarket and a demon might randomly encounter you and randomly try doing something. But
Not the most articulate way that I would put it, or scientific way I would put it. But yeah, an asteroid can, or what is it? A meteorite can fall and kill you. It doesn't have to be, you don't have to be doing anything crazy. You can just be walking down the street. You have an asteroid, piece of space debris, lightning strike. These things happen.
we have God's protection, and we don't need to be paranoid about such things. The bottom line, if you're not invoking demons, then you're not invoking demons, and don't worry about it. Trust God. Say your St. Michael prayer and move on in life.
Your phone can.
No commercials. No music.
About inordinate curiosity regarding demons and the demonic. We shouldn't pretend demons don't exist. But I worry that just as some people use the good of seeking prayers as an excuse for gossip, other people use the good of opposing the demonic as an excuse to indulge unhealthy curiosity about demons. I'm especially concerned about this because on some Christian channels, the most popular videos they host are the ones about demons and the demonic. So I really want to thank Jimmy Akin for coming on the show today. Jimmy, where can people go to learn more about your take on demons, as well as other strange and mysterious parts of our world?
Okay, very good there. Let's go to the next one. Let's see what we got. Okay. That was fun. Whew. Doodle-doodle-doop. Let's see. I want to do another Jimmy Akin thing, Trent Horn thing, and then if we have time, we'll do gospel authorship. I don't know. We might not get to that one.
Hi, this is Paul.
someone sent me this video, and a couple things to say about it.
In a previous episode, I talked about the empty theology of some forms of liberal Christianity that peddle absurdities of faith. But there's another form of Christianity that is just as empty and dangerous, and that's political Christianity. You may not notice it at first because political Christians will make
So originally, I was going to do the opening of, or a portion of his first part of his video, which was on, I guess, liberal Christianity. And then I was going to pivot to this part, to this video. There's a section in here where he's talking about political Christianity that I thought both of those points were interesting. Most of the first video was not very interesting. Most of the second video was incredibly interesting. But there were 2 points that connected between the two that I wanted to talk about. But since this gentleman's analyzing it, let's analyze the analysis, shall we?
bold stands for the truth. They criticize Islam, even to the point of being called Islamophobes, or they criticize transgender ideology to the point of being called transphobes. It's easy to think of them as being just one of the faithful and not as merely a friendly ally. But what the world needs isn't political Christianity. It just needs Christianity, the true faith of Christ that is found in his one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. So what is political Christianity? I've noticed this term being used by atheists like Alex O'Connor and Stephen Woodford to describe people who identify as Christians, at least in some way, or who believe the world needs to be Christian even though they personally don't believe the central truth claims of Christianity. In some of these cases, a political or a cultural Christian outright denies being Christian himself. He might be a self-professed atheist who simply misses Christianity being the foundation of our culture rather than something else like radical wokeism or an encroaching radical Islam. For example, here's Peter Boghossian, the author of A Manual for Creating Atheists, describing the bitter fruits of early 2000s new atheism.
Do you think it would be unfair for me to say that the new atheists perhaps cleared a path?
I think you get where he's going with this, and you know, I did sort of find it a little interesting after reading, and I know some might, after reading just how hard Pope Pius really wanted Mussolini to restore a number of the things that were lost in Italian unification, really wanted to have Mussolini crack down on shows where women were showing too much skin, and to restore Catholic education, and you know, so this whole issue of politics and religion is by no means settled. Again, in many ways, politics is cents and religion is dollars. Politics is now and religion is always. I've said those things many times. But Peter Boghossian is such an interesting case in this, because he starts out, you know, basically, it's kind of hard to figure out, okay, sufficient for what and sufficient to what. And now again, as a minister, someone who would say, come to my church and want to join my church, and would say they are a political Christian but not a believing Christian, would we not let them in the church? Of course not. No, we might not make them an elder or a deacon, but of course they would worship with us. And again, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, with especially the
Yeah, and Ayaan Hirsi Ali is actually a believer. I mean, and Jordan Peterson's reluctance to claim himself as a believer is some kind of insane nonsense that is becoming inane and is losing him an audience.
conversation that she had.
It doesn't mean that he has to be a believer. If he doesn't believe, he doesn't believe. But he has to stop playing the game he's playing.
With Glenn Scrivener, I mean, she's clearly someone who, having seen the fruit of new atheism and the way that new atheism, I mean, basically exactly what Peter Boghossian will say here in this little clip.
By killing God, again, the new atheists perhaps cleared a path by killing God, again, for these new religions these new quasi-religions, pseudo-religions to flourish.
100%.
Is there a link?
It's absolutely true. And I think there was a Pollyanna attitude that many new atheists had that somehow will bury God, borrow a turn of phrase from Nietzsche, and everybody's going to be living in some rational paradise.
Or here's Richard Dawkins, author of The God Delusion, calling himself a cultural Christian.
So I can't give you the I do not believe a single word of.
Most of us have heard most of these arguments.
Right now, it is a time.
And then talks about Ayaan Hirsi Ali a little bit.
I don't like what he's fast forwarding through, because some of this was important.
Notice how Ali phrases this. I choose to believe it. On the one hand, it is true that at some point we have to decide and use our wills when we make an act of faith. We make a choice to accept something as true, even if there are lingering difficulties. But on the other hand, saying I choose to believe it can make it sound like what matters most is the decision to believe something is true rather than the conviction that what you believe actually is true.
Now, there's a whole lot right about this that I don't want to simply dismiss. But in terms of the priority about how real people come to faith, they discover something and they begin to lean into it. And Ayaan Hirsi Ali's story is really clear about this. She found her old way of life unworkable emotionally, and so she starts going into it. Even the story where I'll find the story here in the story. Jesus comes down from the Mount of Transfiguration, and there's a boy, and the disciples have been unable to exorcise the boy. Jesus is frustrated. I'm reading out of the Gospel of Mark. Jesus is frustrated. "O faithless generation, how long shall I bear with you? Bring him to me." And so he asked the Father, "How long has this been happening to him?" And he said, "From childhood. And often he has thrown him into the fire and into the water to destroy him. But if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us." Jesus said to him, if you can believe, all things are possible to him who believes." Immediately the father of the child cried out and said with tears, "Lord, I believe, help my unbelief." It's like, well, how much do you believe, and how much of this stuff is just, this is what I need right now, and I'm going to say what I need to say, and just by virtue of hopefully you doing something for this child that I love. And so, yes, there are certainly issues with political Christianity and Christianity that is sort of lodged in a political space. And again, this is tremendously ironic in the cultural space now, where increasingly you see elements in the broader culture and in nations that are post-Christian, and even in places like France and Italy that are decidedly post-Christian. Again, in the 19th century, when the correspondence between some of the new, let's say, way of approaching the world that was...
I was hoping this was going to be good, but
Now,
this is honestly boring me.
when Jonathan tries to help someone like Peter Boghossian understand where he's coming from, it's really difficult often. And it's really difficult, again, because in some ways hierarchies bind and blind. Again, to these people, depends in Quebec and Saudi Arabia sit outside.
I'm bored. Okay, let's go to another one. Sorry. That did not catch me. Let's see. Yeah.
Introducing Milo's Rewards, the new way to unlock savings from the palm of your hand. With every purchase.
The idea of the authorship, the attributed authorship started, and when people started to question that.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I can share from my own experience. I remember trying to memorize some of the arguments in the book Case for Christ, which came out when I was a teenager.
Strobel, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
So, really convincing to me at that time of my life. But one of the scholars interviewed tried to say, well, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they're not the famous Peter or Paul, so why would the church attribute gospels to these names? So let's try an argument that they're reliable attributions because they're not as significant. Matthew's an apostle, but he's not one of the leading apostles. And Mark and Luke they're associated with the apostles Peter and Paul. While the only case it doesn't work for is John, because he's one of the three main apostles in that group of 12. So, but yeah, I remember learning these arguments and trying to defend it, and then going to undergrad and learning the arguments for and against the traditions. I think what I would want to say is that when it comes to authorship, I know these debates get heated and apologetic versus anti-apologetic stuff online. So I think what I wouldn't want to deny that eyewitnesses could have played a role in the formation of the gospel traditions, or some of the earliest gospels were in a generation of Jesus' life, or even that you can't make a case for some of the traditional authorship. I would just probably defend maybe three theses where I would say the gospels are formerly anonymous. The titles of the gospel according to Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John are secondary, so they were added by scribes. And that we can kind of look at the traditions in the 2nd century and kind of piece together why they made those, why they ascribed them to those figures, and trace the history and development of that. And I think those Christians in the 2nd century were answering questions in the 2nd century. So they're more helpful for how did they receive the Gospels, and maybe not necessarily are they historically accurate to how the Gospels originated. So that would be the approach I'd start with.
Yeah.
Now, your statement that the titles, the attributions of authorship, seem to be secondary. My understanding is that that is primarily based on the fact that our earliest manuscripts where we have attribution of authorship, they're found in different places. They haven't seemed to settle into a specific framework, which is not usually how things are copied when they're part of an original. That's usually how scribes will go about adding information to manuscripts. Is that accurate, or are there other data that influence that conclusion?
Interesting question. Good question.
I have to think about it. I think the main issue is just that the manuscript evidence is late. So
Okay.
I'm not aware if there's any manuscripts that lack the title. There's an article by Simon Gathercole.
And I've heard this response before, not from him, but I've heard this response before to this question.
On the title of the Gospels, which really just compiles all the manuscript evidence. And I think he's put it on his Academia EDU page, so it's really accessible. So you can kind of look at that. So I think the main issue is that the titles are found probably in the late 2nd century. And so, and I know there's some renewed debate about dating some of those manuscripts. I know Brent Nongbury has written some things where you date them later than some would traditionally assign. But let me put it this way. I think with the title, the Gospel According to, it sort of implies that there's more than one Gospel, because otherwise you'd say like maybe the Gospel of Mark. But because you say the Gospel according to Mark, there's knowledge that there's another one according to Matthew. So my
Interesting wordplay, if that works in the Greek as well.
my take would be this is probably when the 4 Gospels have been collected together into an authoritative collection, and you need to differentiate them in some way. So you say this one's according to Matthew, and this one's according to Mark or Luke. And then the manuscript evidence comes after that collection has been formed.
Okay.
And some of the figures in the late,
Oh, by the way, I am still reading the Book of Mormon, and I am still reading John Barton's book on the history of the Bible.
Irenaeus, who's a bishop in the late 2nd century, he knows those titles. So he's probably inherited gospel manuscripts with those titles attached. And then everyone defends that collection.
And my understanding is that Irenaeus is the first to actually attribute the 4 Gospels to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John as we know them. Is that accurate?
Yeah, he's the first that really makes it explicit, where he will, like, let's say he'll quote Mark and he will ascribe it to a gospel according to Mark, which helps, right?
I'm thinking about church fathers and heretics who quoted Bible verses and gospel verses. I feel like Origen and Tertullian are quoting these gospels. So the question is, are they, when they're quoting them, are they attributing them to the titles of the books that we have as we have them today? I think that would be the question. Are the earlier church fathers and the earlier heretics, are they, when they quote the Gospels or the Bible, are they attributing them to the titles that we have for them today? I think that's the question.
That before him, so we'll probably dive into these traditions, but like we have in the early 2nd century a bishop named Papias who lives in what's modern day Turkey, in Asia Minor, and he talks about Mark and Matthew and something they wrote, and there's some discussion about what he's referring to. You'll get other early 2nd century authors who they'll quote things the Lord said or did, but there's debate about are they quoting our Gospels or are they quoting oral traditions that they know, because they don't assign them to a named author.
Okay.
That answers that question.
So, for instance, I know Ignatius, who's a bishop in Antioch in the early 2nd century, he gives a phrase about how Jesus was baptized to fulfill all righteousness. That seems to be picking up on something the Gospel of Matthew says, because it's Matthew's way of defending the baptism. Mark just tells the baptism of Jesus. Matthew.
Now, Origen has a commentary on Matthew. I think also in John. Let's see. When did Origen... Hold on, I'll check something out. So 185 to 253. I don't know. That doesn't seem that late to me. I'm sure to some scholars it does, but that doesn't seem that late to me.
He tries to say Jesus was when John the Baptist protests, I should be baptized by you and not you by me. Jesus tells him this is done to fulfill all righteousness.
I think anything anti-Nicene leads to the credibility of the authorship claims, even if they got it wrong. It lends to the credibility of the authorship claims if there are authorship claims there.
So it looks like Ignatius is picking up on something in Matthew, but he doesn't attribute it to Matthew. He just sort of references it and moves on, right? Or another text called the Didache. It talks about a prayer that's found in a gospel. And it looks like the Lord's Prayer, and it looks like Matthew's version of the Lord's Prayer, but he doesn't say the Gospel of Matthew. He knows it's a text called the Gospel.
I will say that. I do notice that in the translations that I have, they say the Gospel says, or the Scripture says, or as the Word says. It doesn't. I haven't seen a lot of in Matthew it says this. But again, I'm thinking about the commentaries on, Origins. Yeah, he has a commentary on Matthew. So I'd be very shocked if he didn't know the title of the book that he was himself commenting on.
Gospel, unless he's talking about the oral good news that Jesus preached. So that's the difficulty in the first half of the 2nd century.
And you have folks like Justin Martyr who are referring to the Memoirs of the Apostles, just kind of generically.
Yeah, and Justin, I think there's really good evidence that he does know Matthew and Luke when he's quoting the Memoirs of the Apostles. Like he'll cite traditions that are unique to them, or traditions where it looks like, again, Matthew and Luke are editing Mark, and Justin knows the editing of that. Sometimes it says we don't know everything he cites. Like he talks about a tradition about Jesus being born in a cave. Right. And so
That's
did you get that another gospel or another oral tradition? I think he knows Mark as well, because he talks about how Jesus nicknamed Peter or James and John the sons of thunder, and that's unique to Mark. Some scholars think he knew John as well, but it's a little bit. He seems to know John. It's more questionable if he considers it one of the memoirs of the apostles or not. He knows John saying about you have to be born again. He connects that with baptism. But when he actually cites the memoirs, there's some debate about is it just the synoptics and other things, is it just Matthew, Mark, and Luke? The one I've written an article about this because he does talk about the memoirs of the apostles and those who followed them.
Right.
And some try to say, well, that's him saying, well, Matthew and John are apostles and Mark and Luke are their followers, the followers of Peter and Paul. But I think it's more likely he thinks all the gospels are written jointly by the apostles as a collective group and their followers.
I don't agree with that. I don't agree with that assessment.
That
interpretation.
Like their scribes or secretaries. So I don't think you can.
Mind you, I'm reading translations of translations.
Establishing those the 4 traditional titles. I think that you're right. That Irenaeus is our
That's kind of a joke. Copies of copies, translations of translations. You get the point.
Earliest evidence. Though I think it was in place before Irenaeus. But,
okay.
Yeah.
And then Papias is coming. This is around like 120, 130 CE, or even later.
Some date him then. I actually date him earlier, around 100 to 110.
Oh, really?
Well, I think what the reason is, so Eusebius seems to imply like he's coming about with Ignatius around, and also I'm trying to remember.
I wonder how Jimmy Akin's dating against someone like in a discussion, if not necessarily a debate, but a discussion between Jimmy Akin and Dan McCullen. I wonder how that would go. I know that Jimmy did do that with Bart Ehrman, but Bart Ehrman didn't push against it. Dan's a little bit more aggressive. So I'd be interested to see that interplay between the evidence of the dating and why Jimmy dates it the way that he does versus how Dan dates it, and have that conflict and that discussion drawn out and put on audio and video form for us. I think that would be amazing and really helpful to people.
The Roman bishop, but he seems to put him earlier in the 2nd century. Papias seems to be writing before some developments that happened, like he's not refuting Marcion or all these various other Christian teachers that were developing ideas like Marcion or Valentinus or Basilides. The reason he gets dated to as late as you do, there was these fragments that seem to suggest that he mentioned resurrected saints to the time of Hadrian, who are alive, but it seems like the fragments aren't actually. It comes from a later summary of Eusebius's history in the 4th century, and they weren't actually quoting Papias. It was quoting someone else named Quadratus. So I think the best evidence is Papias is probably early 2nd century, and I think that's that might be a majority view among a lot of people. So there's William Shodel who's written some things about this, Ulrich Portner, Robert Gundry. There's some names I can think of.
Okay. Now, Papias has, as you mentioned before, the references to what may be the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of Matthew, but they don't fit as conveniently as many people would like into what we understand today about Mark and Matthew. Could you briefly talk about what Papias seems to be talking about and the relationship you think that might have to the Gospels as we understand them?
Yeah. So what Papias tells us is he has a tradition that he says is from the elder, who he has a prologue where he wants to learn things from a true and living voice. So he's asking who he calls the elders what the disciples of the Lord said. And he names a bunch of disciples like Peter, James, and then he names what they said, and then he names what John the elder and Aristion were saying. So it's a really convoluted prologue where it's like, are the elders the same group as the disciples or two separate groups? And the elders are passing along the words of the disciples. Is this elder John a separate figure from the John, the disciple who had... So John said things, the elder John is saying things, which seems to imply that the elder is alive while the other John's passed away. Maybe.
Right, because I've heard that argument a bunch, that this is the beloved disciple who's reporting things to Papias, but that's an assumption that some folks make.
And again, we're all playing with assumptions. That's kind of the theme of tonight's video. We're playing with assumptions, not presumptions. I mean, this is not opinions without evidence. There are claims that are made by documents, by apologists, by priests, by pastors, by theologians, by apologists, by scholars. There are claims. There's evidence out there to look at, and then it's where you draw the line, where you think it's correct, where you think it makes the most sense. And there are tons of influences in that decision making, of course, and tons of personal bias that you have to overcome to try to find the real truth, of course.
I don't go there myself.
I don't deny that.
The elder John, most you could say, someone in Asia Minor, who was some figure that Papias consulted, and that he eventually gets confused with the Apostle John. So in the late 2nd century, Irenaeus just says Papias is a hearer of John, and he seems to imply he calls him John, the disciple of the Lord, but I think he means the apostle. While Eusebius, who's quoting Papias, so Papias's books haven't survived. We actually only hear quotes from him, and Eusebius is the one who's recording these quotes in the 4th century. He reads the prologue and thinks, no, Papias is talking about two different. There's an Apostle John and the Elder John.
Okay.
But anyways, the Elder John has this.
I mean, I've read Eusebius, so he's not wrong.
Tradition that Mark was the interpreter of Peter.
This guy's not
probably
wrong.
means his translator. That Peter was preaching as the needs demanded from his audience, and that Mark wrote it down. But then he makes a statement that Mark wrote it down not in order. And he says these are the things the Lord said and did. So Peter's recalling anecdotes about things Jesus had did, and Papias wrote it down, but he didn't get the order right because he's a follower of Peter. And then Papias goes on to say Matthew wrote down what he calls the oracles in the Hebrew language, and everyone interprets, or I'd say translates them as best they can. So that's what he gives us. The reason it doesn't, there's debate is, so Papias calls Mark an account of the things the Lord said and did, but he also calls it an account of the oracles of the Lord. And then he calls Matthew oracles, right?
Yeah, this is logia in Greek, right?
That's
so
right.
The sayings.
Yeah, so, well, it'd be interesting. What are these sayings?
And I've heard, and I've even jumped to this conclusion myself a few times, I've heard people try to say that it might be Q that he's referencing and not actually a gospel that we have, a surviving gospel. I don't, even though in my own imagination and my own assumptions that I make, I sometimes lean that way, I don't think there's any credible evidence for that assumption. It is just that, an assumption.
So are these oracles said by Jesus, which would make it, like I think in the past video you did, a sayings collection of things Jesus said? Or are they oracles about Jesus? It's a bit, when you call it oracles of the Lord, it's a bit ambiguous about
So we're back to
the subject saying them or the person being said about.
Yeah, the subjective or objective genitive, that old canon.
Yeah. So
that'll trip you up every time. That'll get you every time.
Taking Greek and Hebrew is what helped me learn grammar. So that's why I was good with the languages. But like, so I take it that they're the oracles about the Lord.
Okay.
Stephen Carlson wrote a big book on Papias where he thinks it's a collection of prophecies about Jesus. But I think, and some other scholars would back me up, would say it's oral traditions about Jesus. So things people spoke, but about the things that Jesus said and did. So that's how I would. So I do think Papias is referring to narrative gospels that consist of things Jesus said and did, and it was the oracles describing these things. So an analogy would be in 1 Peter. He talks about those who speak the oracles of God. He's talking about gifts that people are giving. So they're preachers talking about Jesus. And so according to the tradition, Peter is talking about
going on afterward. I'd be interested to hear about both why you think those are references to what we have today, and the relationship of this process of editing to that.
Yeah. Let me do the first question. So, like when Papias says not in order with Mark, there's some debate about whether he means chronological order, like that. Oh, Mark was not an eyewitness of Jesus. He was depending on the things Peter preached. Peter was giving sermons on different times, and Mark just wrote it down and couldn't get what happened when right. But there's some scholars will say no, it means more like rhetorical order. That if you look at Gospel of Mark, sometimes it looks like stories are put together very loosely. Like it's like, and immediately Jesus went out to the synagogue and did this miracle. And on the Sabbath, he was going along the grain fields. So the connections aren't like, it's not a very structured narrative. And sometimes things are arranged topically where it's like, oh, put the parables in chapter 4 and put some religious controversies in chapter 2 to 3. The one exception is when you get to Jesus, what's called the Passion, the account of Jesus suffering when he goes to Jerusalem and he teaches in the temple and gets arrested and executed and rises again. That's a very close narrative. So that's why there's some debate about whether that was originally a connected story. And Christians were like, we have to tell this story about why this happened to Jesus. They came up with this narrative of his passion, and then they had other independent stories about he told this parable one day, and he did this miracle one day, and Mark's just putting things together. But someone like the Elder John says, oh, I don't like the arrangement of this. Or the other thing is, I think it looks incomplete. Mark just starts, Jesus is baptized. Here's some prophecies about Jesus, and then he's at John Baptist. And the way Mark ends, the tomb is empty. The young man dressed in white said he's risen and he's going to Galilee. Tell Peter and the disciples. The women don't say anything, and it ends, right? So you can think of an ancient reader saying this looks incomplete and not well organized. And then they turn to Matthew's gospel, and they say Matthew starts out with the birth story. You have Jesus' genealogy, you have his virgin birth. So what you get.
But again, these are all assumptions.
Christmas stories. It has 5 discourses of Jesus' teaching.
And this is what apologists do as well. They base their ideas on assumptions, on their own assumptions, and on the assumptions that they find the most believable, other people's assumptions that they find most believable. Not just opinions, but assumptions. So there's opinion here, there's assumption here, and then there's some fact. And all that gets kind of bled together into this kind of thought process. And there's nothing actually there. So you can think anything and still be correct and still be wrong either way. So
they're well organized. Most famously, the Sermon on the Mount, which you'd see in any Jesus movie where Jesus is preaching on a mountain. It ends with the resurrection, and Jesus is on a mountain giving the Great Commission to his disciples to make disciples of all nations. So it seems it's complete, it's well organized. So I think Papias is comparing these two gospels. So that would be my case.
Again, opinion and assumption.
Early tradition from Papias linking it with Peter, who's the chief apostle. That's the case, at least I think. So that's why I think that Papias is talking about those two gospels, but I recognize there's debate on that.
Interesting. I wanted to get into specifically Matthew, because that's, your latest book is about the authorship of the Gospel of Matthew, and it starts with this problem of a story of a tax collector that doesn't quite match up between different Gospels. Talk a little bit about that and why the name of the tax collector might have been changed, or what may have happened there.
Sure. So I think when I said like the first thesis about Gospels being formally anonymous is that when you read the Gospel of Matthew, no author is introduced. Like it just starts like, this is the account of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of Abraham, son of David. So it just jumps into the narrative. It never uses the first person to say.
Yeah, and let me say this: that when you read other holy books, whether it's the Enuma Elish or the Bhagavad Gita or any of those, for the most part, they read like holy books. And then when you read stuff like the Book of Mormon or the Quran, they have what I would call Bibleisms, or in the Book of Mormon, Gospelisms, and it sounds like it's trying to quote what's already been said. It doesn't sound completely or wholly original. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's easy to discount for those of us who are more critical in our thinking and reasoning, these other faiths and these other holy books. So it's harder to dismiss the Bible because the Bible wasn't trying to be the Bible. When a book is trying to be the Bible, sound like the Bible, it's very obvious. When you read something like the Bhagavad Gita or you read something like the Enuma Elish, it doesn't sound like it's trying to be something else. That doesn't mean it doesn't have references to other things or that it's not inspired by other things, but it doesn't sound like it's trying to mimic something else. It's like trying to sound like something else. It's its own unique thing. And I think that adds to the uniqueness and the richness of these kind of works, is that when they get compiled together, their original authorship, their original intent was not for them to be compiled together. Maybe have the newer one, add on to the old one or comment on the old one. But to compress it into a single book, which is what we ended up getting in the Bible, was not the original intent of these authors. The original theme wasn't for other books to be written afterward that matched up to it. So you have historical records, you have courtly records, you have poetry and all this different stuff that gets put into liturgy, gets put into what we now call the Bible. When you read something like the Quran or you read something like the Book of Mormon, it sounds like it's trying to sound like the Bible, which the Bible doesn't have a single sound. So when you do that, it sounds very inauthentic. And I think when you're trying to figure out authorship and you're trying to figure out dating of the Gospels, there is a sound of the Gospels. There's a way the Gospels sound. It's why a lot of less articulate but well-read apologists will say, well, when you read the Gnostic Gospels, you can just tell they're not authentic. You can tell they're not original. Because you can. You can see what the Gospels do, and you can see when someone's trying to sound like a Gospel. They always get it wrong. So I think there is something here in what he's saying. That doesn't mean that I'm going to agree with his dating or anything like that, or his authorship or non-authorship claims or non-anonymity claims. But I think what he's saying is very correct and very true. That doesn't mean that we're going to come to the same conclusion, though. So I like this guy so far. So far, everything I've heard from him is great.
Here's who I am and how I'm connected to the subject. So it just internally, it doesn't say anything about the author. Matthew barely appears in the gospel. Like, he shows up twice. So I think if this was Matthew, you'd probably get more of his recollections about what he himself experienced with Jesus.
Because a good percentage of the book, Matthew couldn't have been present for the story that he's telling.
Yeah, well, at least, especially the narrative of Jesus' death and resurrection, because, the 12 run away.
Right.
Or, of course, the birth stories.
Right.
He could be there as well. He's introduced in chapter 9. So everything before that. So onto that story about the tax collector. The one instant where Matthew does make a prominent appearance in this gospel is he's at the toll booth. So it's a toll booth near the village of Capernaum. So people are probably transporting goods from one area to another, and he's collecting tolls on these things. And Jesus sees him and says, "Follow me," and he leaves everything and follows him. The problem is in the Gospels of Mark and Luke, same story, but the toll collector is called Levi. In Mark, he's called Levi, the son of Alphaeus. So it's trying to figure out what's going on here. So in the early church, we have a couple 4th century commentaries on the Gospel of Matthew, and one of the explanations they give is Matthew was so humble, he was willing to use his more known name to confess, "Yeah, I was this bad toll collector, and Jesus called me out of that." While Mark and Luke wanted to protect Matthew's reputation, so they used his less known name, Levi.
Okay.
So that's an interesting kind of way to reconcile all these things. But like, so the problem,
And that is the correct term for it. This is called reconciliation. You're reconciling differences or apparent differences and apparent contradictions. That's what this is. It's also sometimes disparagingly, sometimes more honorifically called hermeneutics. But yeah, you're trying to reconcile apparent differences and apparent contradictions.
Richard Balcom has written a famous book on Jesus and the eyewitnesses.
And also reconciliation with the Bible isn't just about that. It's also themes and things you don't agree with, or things that seem counterintuitive or counter to your understanding of who Jesus is, or counter to who your understanding of a specific saint or a writer or author is. And sometimes when you can't reconcile those things in yourself, you begin to see a different author there. Again, I'm not poo-pooing on the scholarship that says there's a different author there. I'm saying that in the process of trying to reconcile these differences, sometimes people can't, and so they see a different author there when there may not be. But again, there are pseudo authorships that happen, and there are schools that happen, which they are. Some people call them forgeries today, but they're not forgeries. They're people writing in the name of their teacher or their mentor, writing in the name of the person who wrote. This was done for Socrates. This was done for almost all the major figures you can think of in the world of philosophy, where the school would then write in the name of the person who inspired them. You read some of the works of Plato, the later stuff, probably not by him, but it's still included in his collection of works. So it's just something to think about.
It's a conservative book that defends a lot of the traditional authorship of the Gospels, but he does research names.
That also
And he
happens
says
with
it's not very common for it to have
Buddha
two
and
common
Confucius.
Semitic names, like Matthew and Levi. So you have other characters like Paul himself. His Semitic name is Saul, and then he goes by Paul. Or John Mark is another. John's a Semitic name. Mark's a Roman name. So it's very odd to have the same person have two common Semitic names. And there's no indication that Jesus gives him that. Like, you could argue that maybe he was named Levi and Jesus gave him the nickname Matthew. But there's no story about this. So that's different from, you have an apostle named Simon.
And again, now we're into wild speculation. So we've gone from informed assumption, a formed opinion, to now wild speculation.
The Gospel of Matthew, Jesus says, "You'll be called Peter."
And I'm pointing that out here, not necessarily to pick on this guy, because like I said, I like everything he's been saying so far. But so that you can recognize it when apologists do this to you, when authority figures do this to you. When you get into wild speculation mode, things get ugly, because now their biases come to the forefront. And these biases don't necessarily have to originate with the person speaking. They can speak from other influences that have influenced their way of thinking, or their way of reasoning, or what they think is logical reasoning or reasonable reasoning.
Which means rock, right? So, and the other problem is, in none of the lists of the 12 is Matthew ever also be like Matthew, also known as Levi, right? Which would clarify that. Or some of the copyists actually added Levi's name into the list of the 12. They gave him a Latin name. So some people didn't. They're like, are these two different characters, Levi and Matthew, or what's going on here? So the way I solve this problem, so I think Mark is the earliest gospel. For a lot of, it's shorter. The Gospel of Matthew improves its grammar and style. There's all kinds of arguments for Mark being first. And Mark has Levi the Tolkien. So Gospel of Matthew repeats the same story, sometimes word for word. It's only in a single verse, but he changes Levi to Matthew. And so scholars debate, why did he do this? He does a similar thing where the Gospel of Mark has a woman named Salome at the empty tomb of Jesus. And Matthew, the gospel writer, it's not Salome, it's the mother of James and John. So he doesn't mind switching one character for another. So just question why. So there's different theories about that I can go into if you're happy.
Well, I mean, one of the things that's interesting is that is the idea that the appearance of this character, this now known as Matthew in this toll booth, this tax collector, is that why this book was then attributed to Matthew as a thing? Because it's such a small little moment.
Yeah,
it's so weird.
Yeah, that's what I suspect. But so I guess the theories are like, if you agree with me that Levi was in Mark and he's been switched out from Matthew, scholars have kind of asked why. So one theory is it's such a significant moment of Jesus calling a disciple, and they wanted it to be one of the 12 apostles. So they picked one at random. So that's one approach. Some people have tried to connect Matthew with, like, we've done things with the name Matthew, which is very close to the Greek word for disciple. So they tried to say, oh, he was playing a word game, and that's why he put Matthew, this disciple who's been called. Some people have tried to say, well, maybe Matthew was a source for this gospel. So it kind of functions like a footnote, right? I'm going to put him here so that Matthew's a major source. The theory I adopted, I think it's possible. Maybe Matthew was a toll collector.
Okay, let's see.
But people didn't remember his story. So Mark had this story. It's a very simple story of Jesus calling another toll collector named Levi to be his disciple. And the gospel writer said, that'll fit, right? Let's tell that as Matthew's backstory. So maybe they had some source that said Matthew the toll. So you have all these lists of the 12 apostles, and only in the Gospel of Matthew do you have Matthew's name attached with the toll collector. So could it be they picked up that from a list and then gave the backstory, and they had Mark's Gospel, it told this great story about Jesus calling a toll collector, and that was the basis for it. So, different theories. Scholars will argue that, but I wonder if Papias sees that detail. He has Mark, sees Matthew here and says, oh, Matthew must be correcting the account to Mark, and that's why. So I wonder if that's connected to that detail, that they noticed that difference.
Interesting.
Otherwise, I guess you could say, if you don't think Papias was talking about Matthew, so let's say you think Papias was talking about a sayings collection or a collection of scriptural prophecies they attributed to Matthew, then what you could argue is that later in the church, they looked at Papias writing, Matthew wrote some oracles, and they looked at the gospel, which singles out Matthew, and they connected the two. So that's, I guess, another approach you could take.
Okay.
I think it was instrumental in why Matthew got attributed to Matthew.
Now, what about the Papias' claim that this was all written in Hebrew? Is this linked with the fact that Matthew was so concerned for Hebrew Bible prophecy? Does this have something to do with the gospel to the Hebrews? What are your thoughts on the Hebrew character of Matthew?
I think he's probably just mistaken. I think it's an easy assumption to make that, if it's one of the 12 who wrote this and they're apostles from Galilee, that they would have spoke their native language. I mean, he thinks the same about Mark because it's Peter preaching and Mark translating as his interpreter, right? So I think it's a natural assumption, but I think you're right, though, that he notices kind of some of the features of Matthew, that it's really linked to the Hebrew Bible. Like, it's the gospel that constantly uses this phrase, this was done to fulfill the prophets, such and such. Or it really goes out of the way to portray Jesus as like a new Moses, giving his law and the Sermon on the Mount. Or it seems to be written to a Jewish audience. So Mark will sometimes explain Jewish customs, and Matthew will delete all the explanations. So it's like he presupposes the audience. So I think those are the two things. Thinking it's by an apostle and noticing that it was probably written to a Jewish audience leads Papias to infer that it was originally written in Hebrew. Because all the copies we have of Matthew's in Greek. Yeah. So the reason scholars reject this today is they would say, look, our Gospel of Matthew is a Greek text. It seems to copy Mark's Gospel, which is a Greek text, and in fact improves the Greek grammar of Mark's Gospel. So one example of this, Mark will use the phrase "and immediately" all the time. And immediately Jesus did this, and immediately he did that. It gets a bit redundant. And so the Gospel writer who wrote Matthew, he deletes those references. Or Mark will quote Aramaic phrases of Jesus that he kind of transliterates into Greek. Mm-hmm. And Matthew will remove those phrases. So that makes it more likely that this started as a Greek text and Papias is just wrong about that. Yeah. The only other option, like I said, you could do the other scenario where Papias is referring to something else. Like, if it's a lost save. Yeah, I think he was influential over what he said about Mark and Matthew. So if we kind of go through the history, I don't think Papias won right away. Because like I said,
Marcion had a version of Luke that maybe didn't have the nativity account, and that was added on later. I'm hearing that these theories are out there in circulation. I'm just curious your thoughts on those theories.
Yeah, I'm not sure yet. So I have dated Luke to the early 2nd century.
Okay.
So I guess part of the thing with dating the Gospels is when are the earliest references to them?
Mm-hmm.
So I think, so if you presuppose that Matthew copied Mark, so Matthew, in my view, seems to be referenced by texts like the Didache, Ignatius, and Papias, who are probably, I know there's debate about Ignatius being later, but let's just guess early, at least for Didache and Papias, let's just say early
100 to 110, somewhere around there.
Yeah, so that puts the limit. So you say, oh, Matthew dates earlier, and then Mark dates earlier than that.
Mm-hmm.
The other clue about dating those Gospels is that, they seem to imply that this generation, a bunch of things will happen up to the destruction of the temple, and then the Son of Man will soon come back. And some won't taste death before they see that happen, which suggests, well, maybe they're expecting it within that time frame, right?
Mm-hmm.
Luke doesn't, in my mind, seem to be referenced as early. And Luke inserts things like he has a longer time where he's like, there's going to be this time where the nations are going to trample Jerusalem. So it seems to be like he's allowing for a longer time frame, so he could be dated a bit later. Luke also, Mark tells us that there's going to be this abomination that's going to desecrate the temple. And then Luke comes around and says, that's when the Roman armies laid siege to Jerusalem. So it seems to suggest that he knows the temple was destroyed in 70. And he's not quoted early. I think him and Papias share a lot of similar traditions.
Mm-hmm.
So I think some of this evidence points to him being in the early 2nd century. There's talk about Luke. He quotes some things that the Jewish historian Josephus quotes, or like, so both Luke and Josephus talk about these various rebel leaders.
Mm-hmm.
So there's one, Theudas and Judas the Galilean, and Josephus narrates these two rebels in the wrong order, and Luke has the same wrong order. So it's like, that might be a clue that Luke knows Josephus, and Josephus wrote his history at the end of the 1st century.
Right.
Well, these are the arguments.
And this is all, again, good stuff I agree with, stuff that I've said on this channel before. I know some people don't want to hear that, but it's true. So you can still believe in prophecy and have Jesus prophesizing, but have the writer writing later. Because even if Jesus prophesies, it doesn't mean that the writer was prophesizing. So.
Okay.
The Marcion thing I'm just not sure about yet. So basically, Justin...
And again, that's very evident in the writing when it says Jesus was talking about this. He was referring to this, but people thought he was referring to this other thing. The writing itself is saying that.
First of Marcion's views, but doesn't talk about his gospel. So it's Irenaeus and later that they're talking about Marcion's gospel, and they're all claiming he edited Luke, right? So they're also saying he had some version of Luke, and their view is that he tampered with it, right? So I think like what you noted, they note that Marcion's gospel doesn't have a birth narrative. So I think it starts with Jesus coming into the village of Capernaum. So they're like, oh, Marcion cut out the birth narrative because he didn't even believe Jesus was fully human,
right,
and therefore he didn't want him to be born, right? So I think that's Tertullian that tells us that. Tertullian's this early 3rd century writer, but the good news from Jerusalem to the ends of the earth.
Think there's anything to that observation?
I think
Peter and Paul, this idea that the 4 Gospels, the authors of the 4 Gospels, are.
Irenaeus can say, oh, it was written by Luke, the companion of Paul.
What are your thoughts on? You think there's something to the idea that the 4 Gospels, the authors of the 4 Gospels, are there because they are connected to the main disciples, Peter, James, John, and Paul? We have Luke connected with Paul, that tags that base. John is already there. Peter is connected with Mark, and then James dies too early to write a gospel, so let's just pick up Matthew. You think there's anything to that observation?
I think it's probably more that helped solidify the authorship. That I think you made that point in the past video that maybe that's why no one questions the authors. Like it's still you got your bases covered. That you got Matthew and John are apostles, and John, like you say, is in that Jesus has a group of the inner 3: Peter, James, and John are his 3 main apostles. John's on the list. Peter's technically on the list through Mark. Paul is another main apostle, so that Luke is associated with him. And yeah, James has died, so Matthew. At least they got one of the 12 there. But I don't know. I think it's probably that there's an early tradition from Papias naming Mark and Matthew. So everyone just thought when they accept the authorship, they go to Papias with that. And then as far as Luke and John, I think they reason it out, I think. I guess I should say, so Papias tells them Mark and Matthew, but then they read the Gospel of Matthew, which highlights Matthew, so there's no reason to question that. And Luke and John, they do what Irenaeus did. They connect the we and Acts to the Luke alone is with me in 2nd Timothy. With John, what they do is you have in the Gospel of John a character known as the disciple whom Jesus loves. And he shows up at the Last Supper, at the cross, at the empty tomb. And he's kind of contrasted with Peter. So, Peter has to ask him, ask Jesus who's going to betray me at the Last Supper. Or the beloved disciple and Peter run to the empty tomb. Peter sees the clothes. He has no idea what's happening. But the beloved disciple believes. So it's like the beloved disciple is better than Peter, right? So I think what the early church does is say, who of Jesus' disciples can be close enough that's superior to Peter, right? And we look at Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and Jesus has this inner group of the 12 apostles of Peter, James, and John, and James is killed too early, right? Around 40 CE, he's executed, right? While John 21 seems to imply that the beloved disciple, some people thought he would live forever, right? So it doesn't look like James. So processing.
I'm surprised that nobody talks about the idea of Barabbas living forever. I've heard some people talk about that he was unkillable. That's always a fun thing. I know it's explored in a movie. I'm sorry where it originates, but the movie's older than me, so. But yeah.
Elimination. Well, it has to be John. Because it can't be Peter, it can't be James. Who else is close enough?
Cursed with immortality.
Jesus. Right. So I think it's a fair assumption. You get a lot of scholarship today that will still defend identifying the beloved disciple with John. And that's what the early church does. So Irenaeus says, John wrote his gospel, the one who leaned on the Lord's chest. That's an allusion to the beloved disciple sitting by Jesus at the Last Supper, leaning back to ask him a question. The problem is the beloved disciple is still anonymous. And the gospel is it barely mentions the 12. I think it lists the 12 like 4 times, but it mentions other disciples. You have Nathaniel, you have Lazarus. So the beloved disciple could be an anonymous follower of Jesus who the gospel writer really idealized, saying, that's someone who has the real insight. So I don't think internal evidence demands the Apostle John, but that's how the early church did it. Right. And Irenaeus tells us that, but he wasn't the first one to do it. So he's battling against another, you might call him a Gnostic commentator named Ptolemy. And Ptolemy has already said, John the Apostle says this in his prologue. So probably in the latter half of the 2nd century, this is what the church has done. They've looked at the beloved disciple, looked at the other gospels and said, it must be the Apostle John. And Irenaeus.
And by the church, it means the Catholic Church, by the way.
Is repeating that information.
Interesting. Well, it's clear that this could be an extended conversation. And
we're good. We're good there. All right. So we covered about 4 videos. That's all I'm going to do for tonight. I will talk to you all tomorrow. We're about to play the outro music. I appreciate all of you. Remember, forgive everyone for everything. And remember that God loves you, so love yourself. And love those who are in your life. Peace.
And when you feel like you're nothing, but you wanna be something, yeah. Well, all you really need is hope. I just want you to trust me if you wanna be something.
Yeah, that's right. Let's go. Yeah, when you're feeling down and you're out, like you got nothing but doubt, you're alone in the crowd, just trying to figure it out. All that is bad, and this money got you feeling left out. Listen up to me now, every word that's out of my mouth. Wake up, it's me. You gonna follow your dreams, or are you just gonna be another cog in the scene? You feel the hope in this beat, yeah, the hope that you need to proceed and be exactly what you want it to be. I feel right, and I'm proud, hype and I'm loud. I'ma shout all about how I feel in the now. Ain't nobody ever gonna try to change me till I'm dead, pushing up daisies. I'm alone in the crowd, I won't feel down. I got hope right now, and I know I'll be found. I don't really care just what all other haters gotta say. I know everything I do is gonna make them fade away.
Yeah. And when you feel like you're nothing, but you wanna be something, yeah. Well, all you really need is hope. I just want you to trust me if you wanna be something, yeah.
Yeah.
then all you really need
Yo.
is hope.
Take a look in the mirror, are you seeing some fear? You hear the voice in your ear, can you start to see clear? Are the bad thoughts near? Or can you be where your feet are, yeah, when you stand right here and say no? I'm never gonna give up, I'm never gonna slow. The one that doesn't give up, never loses to a foe. The one that could show to myself I could go all the way to the top, can't stop me. I'm a soldier, always closer till it's over. Older, but I'm bolder.